In this video, we're going to look at stereoisomers, and specifically, we're going to look at a type of configurational isomer called cis-trans isomers, or more generally known as isomers. So remember, stereoisomers have the same connectivity, but the atoms are arranged differently in space. So we're going to take a look at how they're arranged in cis-trans and Ez isomers. So let's just get right into it. Now, configurational isomers that are based on cis and trans are defined as two compounds that have the same structural formula, but the groups are arranged differently in space around a double bond or a ring. And so when you have a double bond, there is no rotation. And that's because, if you recall, a double bond is made up of one sigma and one pi bond. Those pi bonds are p orbitals that are overlapping side to side. And so that takes a lot of energy to break. Now, in terms of our compound here, we have a double bond and we've got chlorine, one on each side of that double bond. And then in the second molecule, we have chlorines on both the same side. So when you have two chlorines on the same side, or two groups on the same side, this is our cis isomer. So we would name this cis, and then it's a 1,2 dichloro, and I'm going to run out of room here, so I'll go on another line, ethene. Okay. For the other compound, when the chlorines are on opposite sides of each other of the double bond, this is our trans isomer. So it's a trans 1,2 blah, 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 dichloroethene molecule. So really, when we're indicating cis or trans in the name, we're just adding it out front in terms of its naming before the numbering happens, so that we know whether we're drawing cis or we're drawing trans. Now, you can also have cis and trans isomers with cyclical alkanes. And so in the first diagram here, I'm showing cyclopropane. So cyclo means it's a ring structure, and then propane means we've got a 3-carbon ring. And the ane means it's an alkane, so there are no double bonds present here. But we can still end up with cis and trans isomerism because we have sort of a sidedness to these cyclical chains where we can have things either pointing up or pointing down. So you can see in these two examples here, with the wedges, these methyl groups are both pointing up, whereas in the second one, we have a methyl group pointing up with a wedge and down with the dashes. So when you see the two wedges here, that means they're on the same side. So this would be the cis isomer. And when you see a wedge combined with a dash, this is our trans isomer. Okay, and then we can use very similar reasoning. So a cyclobutane, in this particular instance, we have two methyl groups, both pointing up with the wedges. That would be our cis isomer. And then the other one would be our trans, because it's got a wedge here and a dash here. So anytime you have those two groups that are similar, you can have them both pointing up, or one pointing up, one pointing down, and you can have cis-trans isomerism in cyclical alkanes as well. Now, sometimes it's not as easy to pick out what groups you're using to decide whether you have cis or trans isomers. So there is a bit more of a general way to name these types of isomers with the EZ system. And so what we're looking at is we're looking around a carbon-carbon double bond, but we're going to use some priority rules called the Kohn-Ingold Prelog, or CIP rules for short. And basically what these rules say is that the higher priority, so the higher priority goes to the atom attached to the carbon-carbon double bond with the higher atomic number. So it's a fairly easy rule to keep in mind as you're going through and figuring out which one has the higher priority. And so if we sort of take this first molecule here and we look at between the bromine and the chlorine, so we want to look on each side of that double bond, then bromine has an atomic number of 35, chlorine has an atomic number of 17. So because bromine has a higher atomic number, it's going to get the priority. So you could put like a 1 there, you could put a star, whatever you want, just to kind of help you indicate which one has the higher priority. If we look on the other side then, and we look at the other two things attached to this carbon-carbon double bond, we have iodine with an atomic number of 53, and hydrogen is just a lonely little 1. So the iodine there is going to get the priority. Now, this molecule here is the same, except our iodine's down here and our bromine's up here. So very sort of similar rules in terms of naming, except instead of cis and trans now, we're going to use E or Z. And so Z is the one that's going to indicate that the two groups with the highest priority are on the same side. And so this is going to be a Z, and then its name would follow after that. I'm not going to name it because this is not about naming. This is just about finding these different isomers. For the one that's on different sides, it's going to be the E isomer. And I like to kind of remember this because the E with the middle in the middle kind of looks like this carbon-carbon double bond, and then it's got a line top and bottom. So it's telling me that the high priority is up here and the high priority is down here. So it's one way to kind of remember the priorities. I don't know if it's great, but it certainly does the trick. So it can get a little bit tricky when you start having really sort of big groups attached to the carbon-carbon double bond in terms of figuring out which one has higher priority. Essentially, what you need to do is you need to keep going along the chain if the same things that are attached or there's different groups attached, and you want to keep going until you find a difference. And that's when you can start assigning higher priorities. So for example, if we were trying to decide between a methyl and an ethyl group, if we look at what's attached to the carbon-carbon double bond, we would start with, if we're going to take this, we would have a carbon attached in either case. So these could be 3 hydrogens, or in the ethyl group, then it would be another carbon attached with 3 other hydrogens. So this is the same, this first carbon here, but this second carbon here is where it differs, because in an ethyl, you're attached to another carbon, whereas in a methyl, you're only attached to a hydrogen. So that means that the ethyl group would get priority over the methyl group. You can also do something similar with these sort of side chains here. So if the double bond is down here, and this was a group, you would want to start going through the chain and looking, okay, where is the difference? So we got a carbon here and a carbon here. All right. That's attached to 2 hydrogens and another carbon, whereas this one's attached to a hydrogen, another carbon, and then it's got this OH group. So because the O is higher in atomic number than the hydrogen, this is the one that gets the priority. If for some reason you have double bonded atoms that are joined and you're trying to figure out the priority, double bonded atoms count as 2 of those groups. So that means in this one here, this is like having a carbon attached to an oxygen. And then if we're counting this as 2, it's like it's attached to 2 more oxygens. It's not really, but we're just counting it as this. So this one would be attached to 3 oxygens. This one, because we got that double bonded, would be attached to 2 oxygens and 1 hydrogen. And then this one here, this last one, would be bonded to 1 oxygen, and it's definitely 1 oxygen, and then 2 other hydrogens. So that means that this has 3 things. This first one has 3 things with the higher atomic number. So that would take first priority. The next one would take second priority because it has two oxygens attached. And then the last one would be the third priority. So it can be a little tricky kind of assigning these different priorities for different side chains, but once you kind of get a little bit of practice with them, they're not really too bad. The last thing I do want to talk about just briefly here is the properties of cis-trans isomers. And really, this is nothing different than what we've seen in various other videos that talk about properties of molecules. They are based on intermolecular forces. So a cis isomer, for example, will have chlorines on both sides in this particular example. Now, because it's chlorines on both sides, it's going to create an overall molecular dipole. This is going to be polar, so we'll have both London dispersion forces and dipole-dipole forces. Whereas this one down here with trans, because those dipoles are pointing in opposite directions, it is nonpolar. There are London dispersion forces only. So now you can make lots of different guesses as to how their physical properties are related to each other, given that these have this first one, the cis isomer, has the stronger intermolecular forces. It's going to take a lot more energy. So this is going to have your higher boiling point, your higher melting point. It's going to be way more soluble in water than its trans counterpart. So that's a really sort of big picture overview of both cis-trans as well as EZ isomers. That's it then for this video. We'll see you in the next one.